I'm now going to talk about roles and factors. So the first role we've already seen, it's the user, particularly the beginner. There's the educator, somebody who's responsible for teaching. There's the tech expert, somebody who knows about typesetting and mathematical typesetting. There's the user experience expert. That's somebody who understands the user experience that people have on the website. I've written the word site generator here. I imagine that the documentation will have large amounts of information and it will be assembled and linked together. So that's a bit like compiling a tech document from many, many parts and getting all the links working. So I rather imagine that the content of the site would be generated from templates and other mechanisms, and that would be an important choice in the whole system. Then there's the information architect, who understands what information is required where, and what information is needs to be provided where. Then internationalization. One way of managing internationalization is to use a restricted vocabulary, restricted form of English, and then the people for whom English is a second language will be able to read it once they master that restricted vocabulary. They won't have to master a large vocabulary of English. But internationalization doesn't necessarily mean translation. It can the English. In fact, if you use the restricted vocabulary well, you might even be able to use automated translation. Next, perhaps it should come earlier, I think it probably should, accessibility. And the visually disabled and blind are the biggest challenge regarding accessibility because they can't see or see well the typeset output. Then there's a question of workflow, which I think is might be another word for information architecture. And the final thing, which I think is really the hardest one, is community of practice. So when I first started working with other people in the tech community to promote tech, I worked with Robin Fairbairns in Cambridge on improving and developing the Tech FAQ. And it was very good actually in its time. It produced both web pages and PDF, which its successor no longer does. And a lot of effort went into it. And that was my introduction, if you like, to the tech community as a community of practice. And the situation now is very different from the 1990s. And things like Stack Exchange exist, and things like Overleaf exist. But the human need for a community of practice is, I think, really important in order to achieve the level of cooperation that would allow a useful system to develop and be maintained. I think I'm thinking of two systems, one developed by Peter Flynn and the other by Carl Berry, if I'm right. Carl Berry's is the unofficial guide to LaTeX, and Peter Flynn's is part of his publishing site. And both of those store the documents in one format and then render out to HTML and other formats as required. And both of those are largely the work of individuals. And whilst the tech book was the work of an individual, I think that improved documentation, a large part of it is actually trying to create a place which contributes to and is contributed from the various documentation efforts taking place. I'll say one thing that the Tech FAQ did was it provided URLs, and for some time persistent URLs, that answered popular questions. And the provision of URLs is one of the great advantages of HTML. that you can provide a URL that answers a question. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very much in favor of HTML documentation rather than PDF documentation. So that's my sort of overview of everything. And I'm going to stop and take a breath